Good afternoon. Welcome to Chatham House. It's good to see so many of you who've defied the tube strike today. In case you're wondering, I'm not Jeremy Bowen, who is detained in Jerusalem, covering the end of the peace process. My name is. Well, I'll get on straight now. Could you put your phones on silent, please? Thank you. Thank you for the prompt. Thank you for the prompt. Yes. My name is Alan Phillips. I'm editor of the Chatham House magazine, The World Today. Right. This event is on the record. It will be live streamed on the Chatham House website. If you have a question for the second half, it is vital to wait for the microphone, otherwise the online audience will not hear you. Today we are using the hashtag #CHEvents, which I hope you can see on either side, and questions can be sent to us via Twitter with the hashtag #AskCH. And I trust you've all put your phones on silent now. The subject of today's discussion couldn't be more topical. It is another turning point. Is Egypt still on a democratic path? Since the revolution of 2011, which led to the downfall of President Mubarak, Egyptian politics has moved at dizzying speed. A new constitution was drafted in 2012, which was then approved in a referendum, but proved unworkable. After the military deposed the Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohamed Morsi, last year, amid widespread protests against his rule, another constitution was drawn up and approved in January by an overwhelming majority of the 38% who voted in it. Next month, May 27th, I think, the former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and Defense Minister, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, is standing for president, and it is all but certain that he will be elected. The outlawing of the Muslim Brotherhood and two recent court cases in which more than 1,000 people were recommended for the death penalty by judges has raised questions about the new constitutional setup. The big question is Mr. Sisi, as he is now, having forsworn the title of Field Marshal, is Sisi at the head of a counter-revolution and determined to return the country to the Mubarak-era status quo, or is he, as he says, preserving democracy? To discuss this, we are fortunate to have Mona Zulfikar in the middle, leading Egyptian lawyer and advocate of women's rights. She was vice president of the committee of 50 people which drafted the new 2014 constitution approved in January. She is currently a member of the National Council for Human Rights in Egypt. On my left is Khalid Abdullah, a British-Egyptian actor and activist who featured in Square about the revolution and is known for many other roles. He is a founding member of the Musirin Collective, which supports citizen media. And on my far left is David Butter, an associate fellow of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House and former editor of Middle East Economic Digest. He's a well-known commentator on Egyptian politics and economy. I will ask each of the speakers to address you for 6 to 8 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question, please wait until all three have spoken. Mona, would you like to start?
Thank you, Alan. It's lovely to be back here. I am actually going to make a few arguments to support a premise that says that transitional periods are always known for being very risky, with a lot of threats of setbacks. And this is very true about the Egyptian transitional period during the last 3 years. However, I've looked back at the last 3 years and have tried to see whether there has been a trend, a consistent trend throughout the 3 years, and concluded that if we do that, we can see that there is a trend arguing and proving that Egypt is on the path towards modernity and democratization. And I'm going to try and give a few arguments on that premise. The first one is, if you look at the last 3 years, when during the January 25 a wonderful 18 days of revolution, where the Egyptian people faced threats of, they actually faced armored vehicles, tear gas, killing, violations of human rights, and they stood strong against that and forced the removal of Mubarak. Thereafter, during the second half of 2011 and the first half of 2012, they resisted the threat of continuing rule by SCAF, the military. They faced violations of human rights and in Mohammed Mahmoud and Maspiro and the lot. And their persistence led into the era of the Muslim Brotherhood, where we had elections and we had a new constitution and so on. When the Egyptians discovered that it was really a hijack of the revolution and that there was no chance for real democracy, true democracy, and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, they stood up again on the 30th of June, and they sustained a lot of pressure, but they managed to prevail and recall former President Morsi. This started with his violation of the principle of separation of powers and his famous constitutional declaration that gave his decisions immunity against judicial review, and his suppression of the media, the judiciary, the siege of the Supreme Constitutional Court, and all of this. The Egyptians felt the threat and stood up and stopped this and reversed this. Since then, we have had the new constitution, and there were a lot of challenges. It was not an easy ride to get this constitution through. We had the threat of polarization, threats of pressure groups, whether they are the Muslim Brotherhood trying to protect, and the religious affiliates, other political parties, trying to protect their spoils and the benefits they have acquired under the 2012 constitution. Whether you have non-MB groups like the military on military tribunals, like the workers and farmers, because they had the benefit of a one-time 50% quota, or other groups that had specific interests under the 2012 constitution. You had a lot of challenges to get this through and protect the basic objectives and the purposes of the January 25 revolution and its second wave on June 30th, 2013. Nevertheless, among all the basic human rights and freedoms that were protected and preserved by the new constitution, stands out a very important change that was introduced, and that has to do with the guarantees of implementation of the new constitution. There are several guarantees of implementation, including, that you cannot change, Parliament is not allowed to approve any amendment that breaches or prejudices the principles of freedom, equality, and the 2 terms of the president. And this reflects, because we have lessons learned. We have, during Sadat, we remember when the constitution removed the upper limit of 2 terms of presidency, and what happened since then. So no more. This will never happen. The checks and balances on the powers of the president, accountability before Parliament, the ability of Parliament to recall or impeach the president. All those present new ideas that reinforce and guarantee the implementation of democratic principles under the Constitution. The most important development that changed during the last 3 years is a new generation of Egyptian people, conscious, politically conscious, that their focus is no longer on football, but on politics. They are aware of everything that happens or that is being cooked behind the scenes. They are engaged, politically engaged. And they will not let their dreams or their objectives fall apart easily. This is a very important change because during the last 3 years, where lessons have been learned the hard way, precious lives have been lost, a lot of losses, our reserves have been depleted, a lot of issues and problems, threats of polarization, threats of civil war, threats of terrorism that are not only in Sinai, but that now extend over other parts of Egypt. Our neighborhood is not very friendly, as you all very well know, whether it's the south in Sudan, Libya, to the west, or our east with all what's happening in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and so on. So we have a lot of risks and so on. But with all of this, at the same time, simultaneously with all what is happening, a new generation of Egyptians. And what I mean by a new generation is not by age. It's not just a new generation that is coming up like Khalid, where we are very proud of our new generation, but also a new generation in the sense of engaged Egyptians that come from different walks of life, that come from different political affiliations, but that are determined to build a civil, democratic, modern, rule of law state, are determined to have institutional reform that is required to implement all those principles in the Constitution, that are determined to have what they came up for in January 25 and June 30th, to redeem the Egypt, the multicultural identity, the Egypt they know and they love, and to really build a democracy, a rule of law state that would give them all equal opportunity without any discrimination. This new generation is what I am relying on, that is gradually emerging and that is putting pressure. The next president, when he takes office, he is going to have a constitution that limits his powers, that puts checks and balances on his authority, sharing political power with the prime minister, accountable before parliament in the choice of cabinet and in even a cabinet reshuffle. The parliament has a word to say. Parliament can send him back home. Those are new facts of life. And more important, the new president will have to remember that this new generation of emerging Egyptians that I've just described have toppled 2 presidents and changed 2 constitutions in 3 years, and is determined to claim the Egypt they want, the modern, civil, democratic Egypt. That's what I am counting on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona. Khalid, would you like to speak for the new generation?
No, I can't speak for the new generation. I can do my best to try and speak for myself. But I think if we're to ask the question, is Egypt on the path to democratization, there are really 2 major strains to thinking about that. One is about the broader brush of where we're headed, whether that's over the next 5 to 10 years, and the situation with the current political status quo. And I would argue that the case between those two is massively divergent. For me, when I define democracy, the two most important words I would use, or notions, is the notion of accountability, the notion of pluralism, and far down on the list would be the vote. And the vote, of course, is an absolutely essential part of the mechanisms of democracy. But very often, unfortunately, we confuse the relationship between those elements. It's clear to me that the current status quo in Egypt is that we are in one of the darkest periods that we've had in a very long time. We are in one of the bloodiest years that we have had, and we've had a lot of bloody years over the last few. When we talk about the accountability of power, I see next to none. When we talk about pluralism on an institutional level, I see next to none. When we talk about the state of our institutions, I see that the majority of them are decrepit and are, if not in danger of collapse, in a very dangerous situation, even in terms of how they would be reformed. Which comes to one of the central issues in relation to how one would discuss the situation in Egypt on a kind of broader political level, is the question of, and this is really where, on a practical basis, so many of us will, this element, very many of us will agree ultimately on what we want to achieve. But there are major questions, I think, over the strategic nature of how that is achieved. What elements of that require systemic change, for which I would say revolutionary change, and what elements require reformist change? And how do you fight? I mean, this is a crucial question. I think if I look at the months ahead, I think we have a very, very dark period ahead of us that will unfortunately have a lot of blood. I am also, just to be clear, I'm someone who rejects both I reject the binary that is placed in front of us, that the choice is either between the military or the brotherhood, actually, systemically, in many ways, I see them as, on many ways, actually closer than also they would seem, in terms of many elements. Obviously, they're massively divergent. Anyway, maybe that's a discussion that we can come to later. The current, I don't see that the current situation that we're in is actually what's going to, institutionally, is what's going to take us to the safer shores. I actually agree with many things in what Mona has said. But fundamentally, when I look at the battle for accountability and pluralism, I see that fundamentally it is being guaranteed by this new generation. It is being guaranteed by the people on the street. It is being guaranteed by people who have reached have reached the absolute end of the line in terms of how they can live their lives, such that there come points of necessity where, if you cannot provide for people's needs, and we're talking about everything from the most basic glass of water to air that you can breathe, to food that you can eat without feeling that it's cancerous, and all of these kinds of things. If you cannot provide that, then your reign and power is going to be in danger. And so the real question is, Sisi and the current establishment are, I believe, on the one hand, thriving on an absolute and in many and legitimate rejection of the Muslim Brotherhood. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, they're also riding on a very strong dream that maybe this man can fix it.
Yeah.
The question then becomes what happens when he can't or he doesn't. And I think when you look at the state of the institutions, when you look at the state of the economy, when you look at the state of accountability, of pluralism, of rights, of freedoms, of torture, of people being killed, of the thousands of people in prison, of all of these things, of even the enforceability of a constitution which has many good things in it, even though I have massive disagreements with it, in particular in relation to the military, which, lest we forget, was not put there by 2013, was put there in 2012 by the Muslim Brotherhood. Then that's where you ask the big questions, and that's where you remember that you're in a revolution. A revolution, as far as I would define it, is not something that is a few days or a few weeks or a few months. It's a period in which massive social change is possible in a very short period of time because people have identified very clearly the strategies that can change their world very quickly. It's a very dysfunctional way of creating a system of checks and balances. And ultimately, you have to reach a period of reform, which is real and goes in, and in many ways, I see, for example, this document as a success in some ways of our argument. I don't see the Constitution as the final solution, but I see it as a sense that we are gradually winning the argument in our various different places, in the various different ways in which we're fighting. But I don't see the current situation as in any way, or shape or form, a form of democratization. Far from it.
Thank you very much, Khalid. David, you've been studying Egypt for a year or two. What's your thoughts?
Well, thank you. On the core question of is Egypt on the road to democracy at the moment, I'd say no, but I think that the constitution, the elements that Mona mentioned mean perhaps, and we hope so, but it's going to take a long time. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I see the current situation, partly from the outside, and how international actors see Egypt. And I think to some extent this is a question of how little democracy is compatible with stability. This, I think, is partly a message coming from the Egyptian state to the outside, and there's a kind of bargaining going on with the United States and the European Union about where that line can be drawn. At the moment, the United States, as I think was very clear from their recent statement, are concluding that there is not sufficient democracy in Egypt to give the country a clean bill of health. They need to see what happens in the presidential and parliamentary elections. They talk about freedom of media, freedom of assembly, and so on. So there's still quite a lot to go between, even a rather cynical international community is going to go along. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I kind of see the interest groups in Egypt interacting with each other, and whether at some point that can arrive at a sort of reconciliation that would lay the basis for democracy. I think that we can't stress too much that when you have events like a judge passing out 1,000 death sentences on a totally arbitrary basis with no particular outcry against that, this is marginalizing, this is almost dehumanizing a large part of the population. Likewise, when you have 20,000 people stuffed in basements of Central Security Forces barracks around the country with nobody knowing where they are or what they've done, them being dehumanized under the label of terrorism, this is not a healthy basis to move forward with democracy. However, there are lots of other things going on in Egypt, but I think we can't forget that this important segment of society, broadly defined as being in the Muslim Brotherhood sphere, but I wager that very many of these people have got nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood at all. And of course, that just being part of the Muslim Brotherhood is not cause for the treatment that's being meted out to these people. So I think at the moment you have the anatomy of a security state, and I think that this is not necessarily a stable security state. It never has been in Egypt. There have always been power struggles within the security state. And the main elements of that would be the army and elements within the army, the intelligence services, basically three branches, one answerable to the president, one to the police, and one to the army itself. And you have the police and the interior ministry. I think probably the most important thing which Sisi did, he still calls himself the Mushir, by the way.
Does he?
Yes, on his Twitter feed, so he's not totally given that up.
So just given up the uniform.
He did after what one day with, I think, fantastic euphemism called the recall of Morsi, was he appointed a new head of the General Intelligence Services, somebody who he had full trust in. So the actions that have been taken since then, the decision to go all out, what I think in the Algerian context you'd call an eradicationist strategy against the Muslim Brotherhood, was taken in a conclave, which we don't really know exactly what views there were, but we can see Sisi, you can see the intelligence chief Tahami, you can see the interior minister as being the three individuals and the institutions most importantly involved. But the face, if you like, of repression in Egypt at the moment is overwhelmingly the interior ministry and the police, whoever's behind that. But it is the interior ministry and the police. I think the Financial Times a couple of days ago reported on 30 camps around the country in Central Security Forces barracks. But it's a police phenomenon that is up front, and then it's the more rogue police-affiliated parts of the judiciary which are pressing down on people. Now, I don't think this relationship between these institutions is necessarily stable. I think there is a point at which, if a new president is elected, that he has to consider his options in terms of reaching out to other parts of society. I think the messages coming to Sisi once he's elected will be about the importance of some form of national reconciliation, which will create some difficulties in terms of the relationships inside this security establishment. Going fast forward in a way, so a lot of when I was talking about the accountability enshrined in the Constitution being very much vested in Parliament. Well, we have to get to Parliament first, and we have to get an idea of what Parliament might look like. Now, we don't have the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamist trend going to be participating effectively in politics. We have a number of older and new parties which are mobilizing broadly on a kind of centrist agenda. Some of them may come together. The question is which group or bloc is going to be the loyalist bloc, the pro-Sisi bloc. Are we going to see some sort of tail wagging the dog in terms of politics, as was the feature of National Democratic Party politics in Egypt, of local interest effectively getting themselves elected and then taking on the identity of the National Democratic Party? Are we going to see something a bit like that? Probably not. We're going to see something different. But I would argue that the weight of the first parliament, anyway, is likely to be a pretty solid loyalist sort of block of established interests. So I'm sure we can talk a bit more about that, but I think I'll just close with some remarks about the stability. The view of the business community in Egypt, and of the international business community interested in Egypt, is that they want stability. Stability is needed because stability is a precondition for the inflows of investment into the Egyptian economy, without which it cannot survive. One of the most alarming statistics I saw recently was a forecast from the IMF in its World Economic Outlook of Egypt over the next 5 years. Now, the current account deficit for that period, this year, $15 billion rising to 30. So you've got a $100 billion financing gap effectively to be filled over the next 5 years, one way or the other. At the moment, it is being filled by Gulf funds. The 1/5 of the revenues in the Egyptian budget this year so far is denoted as grants from Gulf governments. 1/5. So the Gulf governments are paying for a huge budget deficit. deficit, which without these grants is 14 or 15% of GDP. Even with these grants is 10 or 11% of GDP. The Gulf grants now are the biggest source of current account revenue, more than remittances, more than tourism, more than exports. Gulf grants are keeping Egypt afloat. Now, there is an agenda behind these Gulf grants, what the Gulf states view as the future of Egypt. That's another story of whether they view the future of Egypt in the same terms of a democratic transition. I don't know. But the situation in terms of the economy is absolutely perilous. Whoever does take on the presidency and then the government cannot escape this very difficult balancing act between hitting living standards through cutting subsidies, for example, and through doing something with this huge wage bill, and maintaining levels of investment which will create growth and which will start to pull Egypt out of this dependency on external aid. It's a hugely challenging set of problems, and I think at the moment it's going to be a difficult one to reconcile with a rapid move towards democracy.
Thank you very much for David for explaining the contradiction between stability and democracy and other things. We can move on to questions now. There are some roving microphones. I shall start in the front, this gentleman here. If you can identify yourself, say who you are, and ask a question which is answerable, that would be useful.
I can't promise how answerable it is, but that's the panel's.
Yes.
Up to the panel. David Pollock, a member of Chatham House. Thanks very much to the panel. Could I ask, what are the prospects for any semblance of an independent judiciary under the new constitution and after the elections?
I think that one should go first of all to the lawyer amongst us. A lot of people have been shocked at what seems to be the total arbitrariness of and indeed vengefulness of the sentences handed down recently to over 1,000 suspected members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Is there any hope for an independent judiciary?
The independence of the judiciary, the rule of law, and the submission of the state and the judiciary to the rule of law are, of course, principles that are very much confirmed in the Constitution. But and there are guarantees of implementation in the Constitution. But having said that, it is very important to modernize and reform our judiciary, the judicial establishment. You have to understand that our fight for independence of the judiciary is long. I mean, it hasn't started only during the last 3 years. We have been fighting through the last 60 years of dictatorship for the independence of our judiciary. And the judiciary has not had sufficient support to modernize, to bring in better resources in terms of human resources, training, technology, etc. They have an overpopulation problem where we only have like 15,000 judges and we have millions of cases. There are structural problems that have to be faced in the procedural rules and in institutional reform, including reform of the laws, etc. Having said this, I mean, this has to go, to happen. And I have heard the president of the Judges Club saying that they are inviting for a major conference on justice, enhancing justice. And if you remember that this dates back to 20 years ago when they started their conferences on enhancing justice, and this is when they also had all the problems with the executive power. They had problems with President Nasser, and they had problems with President Sadat, and they had problems with Mubarak, and they had problems after that with Morsi, and so on. They have now protection under the Constitution, but they have to prove themselves worthy of all this protection by making sure they are accountable, because they are accountable under the Constitution. But with respect to self-assessment, assessment of judges, holding accountability for professional performance, etc., this is internal. They are accountable under the law, and they have to come up with good work to show that they are worthy of this independence. Now, going to those shocking judgments that have been passed. The first one for 528 has been actually it has been passed a couple of days ago. It was not passed earlier, and the judgment reduced the penalty to life sentence for 490 or so on, and only 37 with the death penalty. And I just heard today that the public, compared to 528, you have its proportionality, you know. 528, it's shocking. Anyway, the reduced to, I'm just telling you the facts, you know, what happened. I heard that the public prosecutor challenged the death penalty for the 37 that have been condemned to the death penalty. And the rest, this is still subject to appeal, so I am confident that it will be successfully appealed and challenged.
Khalid, are you confident that the justice system can quickly redeem itself?
No, but it's not. I mean, we have to be clear as well how we talk about these things in a way. I mean, the independence of the judiciary, it may indeed be structural within the law, but how enforceable is the law? Number one. Number two, are the judges themselves in their own opinions politicized, and do they use those opinions? I mean, when we talk about the case of I think it's 1,200, over 1,200, those death sentences, actually, sadly, I would say that judgment is, as much as it may read like a political decision from on high, it's not. I don't think. I think it's a decision from a crackpot judge in Minya who, either for careerist reasons or for personal reasons, for his own political whatever, has decided to make these ridiculous judgments in single sessions. I mean, and I know you'll agree with me on this, but I mean, even with them being commuted, you've still got life sentences for, 490, I think it is, 2 people on the basis of one session, many of which weren't even there. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of, this is why I say the entire institutional framework is decrepit.
Right.
And what that sends to you, what signal that sends to you as a citizen, is that there is no legal framework that can support you unless you're powerful enough, which is the basis of corruption. Simply. Take that out of the legal system and apply that to other realms of power or other realms of, and you're talking about essentially the same structure, which is why it's, there is no media. Forget the media. You can't talk about anything which is against not even the status quo, but the specific definitions of the status quo. So I mean, within those frameworks, the law essentially, on a civil basis, I don't know if that's the correct technical term, but that's what I would use, collapses. As far as I'm concerned, it may be able to enforce issues which it sees in its own interests, according to the law it should enforce, but that may not be in the general interest of the country or the people of the country.
Thank you very much, Khalid. I think you had a question, did you?
Thank you. Laura James, independent consultant. I was very much struck by the high hopes that everyone is placing on this new politically mobilized generation in Egypt. But I was wondering what proportion of the population is excluded from that. I'm thinking particularly perhaps of the rural poor, but there may be others. what kind of proportion do you think are not mobilized and have no effective mobilization structures or ways of putting their opinions forward? And are there any routes by which they might in the future become mobilized? Is that a subject of discussion? And if so, which issues are salient for them?
David, do you want to attack that? Do you have to have been to the American University of Cairo to be mobilized?
No, I think that's, there clearly have at moments in the last 3 years been a mass mobilization beyond what you describe as a privileged minority, and a mobilization that has included all segments of society. But it is an important question in terms of the demographics of Egypt and also the politics of that. The population rate actually has rather increased in the last 3 or 4 years. We're now getting back to about 2.6% after it going down below 2% for a period in the Mubarak period. And we have something like 53% of the population now aged 24 or younger. I think another important issue is in terms of the marginalized poor. If you look at something like the recent increase in the minimum wage carried out by the Biblawi government under the idea that they would try to put money into the system to sort of stimulate some consumption. This was very discriminatory because it ended up being only for people working in the government sector, as government employees by themselves. So even people in the wider public sector weren't involved with this increase in the minimum wage, which of itself was unwise given the state of the budget. But it also did not include anybody in the informal sector or the small private sector in Egypt. It would be a problem for better constituted private businesses, which will feel pressure to meet this minimum wage. But for people out there, the vast majority of Egyptians who get by with a variety of jobs or in broadly defined private sector areas, this was totally irrelevant. And I think that was part of a mindset which is not really recognizing the importance of addressing the real needs of this marginalized majority.
Gentleman in the front. Can we have a microphone?
Thank you very much. My name is John Preston, member of Chatham House. My question is about the media. How effective is the media in terms of the question being asked about the democratic path? And I'm interested to know what the media are and who reads, listens to, or watches the media, and how would you describe it as an effective force given that you're trying to get towards democracy?
Who wants to tackle that?
I guess I'm
Yes.
closest.
Yep.
Currently there is state and private media. All of the powerful arms of the media are a single mouthpiece or a collective mouthpiece for the current political status quo. That is where their money comes from. That is the structure of interest into which they are embedded. And even those voices, most of the voices who were able to speak differently over the last 3 years have been put off the air or have been repeatedly threatened. And those who even put out a slightly differing opinion are threatened in all sorts of different ways. Whether that's whether it's in the, part of the way it works is also in the structural framework of advertising. Advertising will be taken away. The structure of advertising is directly related to the interests of the political elite. So the media landscape in Egypt is a complete and utter disaster. On the other hand, and this is something I consider myself part of and others, there is a very vibrant, obviously, media landscape online, which is very powerful in terms of how it breaks the dominant narratives that are being peddled through the state and private media. It has very effective ways of setting agendas in terms of what is being talked about. The difficulty is, if we're talking about what I would hope to be a progressive media landscape, the difficulty is that the current situation in Egypt is massively polarized. And the actual structure of how one would talk about things requires an extraordinary complexity, because really, in terms of the major frameworks, you have to find a language which is not instrumentalized. In order to open up a middle ground, you have to find a language which is not instrumentalized by one side or the other in your fight against either. And within the frameworks of social media, even though a lot of that is happening, it's difficult, because you need wider space. You need the possibility of longer conversations. And you also need to be able to reach people who are outside the digital divide. I mean, I actually think one of the biggest things that we forget when we talk about media is that one of the most powerful forms of media is word of mouth. And word of mouth in Egypt is very powerful. It's also very changeable. And I think it's very clear, to me at least, that over the last 6 to 9 months, and before that obviously, but in terms of speaking now, that the situation is changing very, very quickly in terms of what people think about the current status quo. And unfortunately, the media is only really able to speak to that when those narratives become dominant. The media's ability to present counter-narratives is nigh on non-existent.
Can I bring in David?
Well, I think when Khalid went butt, that brought in some of the things I wanted to say.
Right.
But I'd just like to say I think there is, the experience of the last 3 years has brought to my attention anyway, a lot of very good journalism, a lot of Egyptians who are sort of champing at the bit to take advantage of whatever freedoms they get in the media. That said, of course, the window's been closing, but they're still there. There are a lot more of them. And this is, I think, a very important part of the long-term health of the country, that these people should have their voice.
I also want to jump in and add on the positive that we've had a journalist syndicate, or the press syndicate. They have had an increasing important role in defending freedom of the press and freedom of opinion, and including defending all journalists from different political sects, brotherhood, whatever. So they have had a very important role. And this, again, is part of the new generation, where you've had a lot of elections in professional syndicates, in trade unions, independent trade unions, student councils, NGOs, movements, and you've had a lot of those organizations playing an important role in the social media, as Khalid said, and also supporting journalism and independent journalism. Not to bother you with the new constitution, but it does play a very important role in setting the agenda for the future, in that there will be no Ministry of Information, there will be an independent press and information council, an independent organization that would even own what we call state-owned media, etc., and so on. So there is a plan in the Constitution for further liberalization of all the press, the state-owned press and the media. And this is important to note, that there is a hope in the future as things develop.
Okay, we have slightly less than 10 minutes left. I'll take 3 questions and we'll deal them together. In the yellow tie, gentlemen.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the panel. My name is Tom Riley. I'm from Shell. I have 3 separate one comment and 2 questions, if I may.
Oh, you're stretching me. All right.
So the first comment is, there feels to me an element of hypocrisy in the current leadership wrapping themselves in effectively the flag of the 2011 revolution, when 2013 merely seems to have reinstated what 2011 overthrew. So maybe you'd like to comment on that. The second point is about pluralism and political pluralism. I don't agree with it, but I understand the reaction against the Muslim Brotherhood, but it doesn't really explain, for example, the criminalization of April the 6th. And the final point is, you mentioned the constitutional assurances, but Mubarak governed under a constitution as well, and he rode roughshod over it. So if you can't trust the judiciary, how do you enforce the constitutional assurances? Or is it again a question of relying on the street?
The lady there, on the back row.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Laura Conkle. Thank you very much for your comments today. I'm a member of Chatham House. I'm also a legal trainee here, so that's why I'm particularly interested with regards to the judiciary. And I was curious, you mentioned specifically the idea of protecting the judiciary within the Constitution. However, I wondered how the judiciary is regulated in Egypt. Is it a self-regulated profession, as is the legal profession in Canada and the UK? Or how do we have this accountability within the profession? Is there a shift within this accountability from the lawyers themselves? And how do you see this trajectory moving? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more. We've got a question from outside the hall.
Yeah, I have, my name's Solomon, but I work in the communications department here. I have a question from Twitter for Khalid that I will just bring up now. I've managed to lose it just as I got the microphone. One moment. It was on the question of the dichotomy between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. Khalid, you said that you rejected that dichotomy of those are your only two options. And the question is, you're right, but who's going to stand up as a viable alternative to end violence, reform law, and save the economy?
Right. Let's start with that. Who is the viable alternative? Briefly, Khalid. You've got two big beasts.
Briefly
here.
isn't going to happen, but
No.
I'll try. Well, I mean, the question to me belies a misunderstanding of what a revolution is. If the viable alternative existed, we would have taken it straight away. A revolution is it's a revolution against a system of power, a system of government, a network of interests. And it's very clear that that network of interest, that system of power, that system of governance is still there. It's taking massive knocks, but it's fundamentally still there. We are living under, a revolution. It's a crucial thing to remember, and as much as it is one of the most beautiful affirmations of the human spirit, is a sign of failure. It is a sign that things have got so bad that the only solution is for a mass uprising, which is unfortunately uncontrollable and dysfunctional in how it works, in order to begin to be able to find changes. Now, I salute the work of anyone who tries, nonetheless, to try and navigate through that in practical ways, to try and find those things that can begin to plug holes and do that. But fundamentally, I think there's a point at which you can't plug holes anymore. And that's something that we just have to accept as part of our current status quo, as far as I'm concerned. Meanwhile, doing a hell of a lot of work that I think a lot of us are doing in rebuilding inside, whether it's inside or outside our institutions, whether it's within civil society, in our unions, in our companies, in our organizations, whatever they are. And I see a hell of a lot of that work being done, while at the same time there is an entire shift in consciousness and culture that is happening in the country that I believe over the coming years will begin to deliver that viable alternative that people desperately want. I'm very clear that people desperately want. But if we turn it into a vote here, or a law here, or a policy here, then we're doomed, because the framework in which it could be that we just choose a president or just vote a parliament is over. The idea that that could have been the solution was a long time ago. So now we're in a totally different framework in which we have to work in a different way. And that's where I believe we're in a revolution, and that's where we have to understand what systemic change is, as opposed to easy reformist change where we kind of judge things as if they were presidential terms, which they're not.
Thank you. Two quick questions for David. Hypocrisy, Sisi wrapping himself in the 2011 flag, and how can you have pluralism when the April 6th youth movement has been crushed?
Well, I mean, I think we haven't got much time left. There was another question. I think those were more comments than questions, and it's quite clear that, you know, they were well put.
Enough said. Right.
So,
the judiciary, is it self-regulating?
the judiciary is self-regulated internally. As far as hiring, there is a law that organizes the hiring and the career path of judges and the choice and selection criteria and accountability. But they are internally accountable and they are dismissed internally. And if they commit offenses, we have judges that have been put on trial and put in prison, etc., etc. So it has been going on like this. It is not publicized when they dismiss judges, etc., but it happens all the time. So this is the legal system that is in there. Now, I want to comment on systemic reform. And nobody is claiming, at least as far as I'm concerned, that we are after, you know, the slow step-by-step reform. It will not work. It will not work. The institutional reform that we expect from the new generation is a qualitative reform, is structural reform in the institutions of the state, be it the judiciary, be it the bureaucracy, be it the police, be it the media, be it all of this. I mean, it is structural reform that is needed, that is claimed by the Egyptian people when they revolted, and that will have to be respected and implemented. It is also the kind of structural reform that is envisaged in the new constitution, because otherwise it will not be implemented without proper institutions to protect those principles and to respect them and to enforce them. So we are not looking after the old, I mean, the insinuation that this is back to the Mubarak regime. There is no going back. I do not think that there will be going back. I mean, during the last 3 years, we are facing setbacks. But generally, I think that the trend is for showing that those setbacks will not work and that new initiatives are required, new leadership is required, structural institutional reform to put Egypt on the path of modernity and democratization is required. And this is what keeps coming back. So it proves that the old ways will not work.
With respect, though, I mean, with respect, I agree with you entirely that that is the trend. But systemic change will never happen when the upper hand is with the army and the police.
Absolutely.
And the
I
upper
agree.
hand, and the upper hand,
I agree.
and
But
the upper
that's
hand-
why the new
and the upper
generation.
ha-
But that's why the new generation. But no. But that's why the new generation has got to place its weight and to make things work and move forward, taking all the difficulties and the challenges into consideration. I mean, we have an economy that's going to collapse. We have freedom that is under threat. We have human rights that are suffering. So how are we going to go? We have to, this block of new generation, of political new generation of Egyptians that come from different walks of life, different ideologies, are going to put their weight where it should be and are going to push the change agenda into that way. I mean, whether you call it revolutionary systemic change or you call it systemic change through political process is for us to see. But it is absolutely preferable to do it through political process. If this is doable, this is in the best interest of all people. If you have the old establishment, we can definitely, if you like, have the new political parties move the agenda forward, the new NGO community, the new move forward, and stand up to violations and make the change happen. Do you have any other way?
No, thank you very much. I'm afraid our time is out. On that optimistic note, I will thank our panel, thank Khalid Abdullah, Mona Zulfikar, and David Butter. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And if you give them a show of approval.